In July of 1099, Crusader knights broke through the walls of Jerusalem and did not stop killing for days. A chronicler riding with them wrote that his own men waded through blood up to the reins of their horses. A knight had sworn safety to a crowd, then broke that oath before the streets went quiet. Today, 10 medieval crusades changed the world forever, and the last one ends the era for good. Let's go. Number 10. The Massacre of Jerusalem. 4 years before the siege, Pope Urban II had stood in a field outside Clermont in France and told a crowd of knights and peasants that God himself was calling them east. Every soldier who took the cross and died reclaiming Jerusalem, he promised, would have every sin of his life wiped away on the spot. Chroniclers say the crowd began shouting the same 2 words back at him, over and over, until the field itself seemed to be chanting. Within months, tens of thousands of men from France, Germany, and Italy had sewn red crosses onto their tunics and started walking east, most of them with no real idea how far away Jerusalem actually was. By the time the survivors reached the walls of Jerusalem in June of 1099, they had been marching and sailing for nearly 3 years, and roughly 2,000 miles of that journey were paved with their own dead, buried along Balkan roads and Anatolian passes, lost to hunger, thirst, and ambush. The army that finally camped outside the city was a fraction of the force that had left Europe, and it arrived with almost no siege equipment, having stripped forests for timber along the way just to build ladders and towers. For 5 weeks the Crusaders starved outside walls defended by a garrison that knew exactly how badly they needed water in the summer heat. 8 days before the final assault, the entire Crusader army walked barefoot in a religious procession around the city walls, while the defenders jeered and spat from the ramparts above them, mocking crosses set up in plain sight, and, according to some accounts, urinating from the walls to insult the marching column below. The gesture was meant to shame God into action after 5 weeks of failure, and it did nothing to break the siege on its own. But morale inside the Crusader camp had reached a point where a barefoot walk through open ground under jeers felt like the only weapon left to try. On the 15th of July, siege towers finally reached the walls near the northeast corner, and a knight named Littold was the first man over the top. What happened in the hours after that breach is the part chroniclers could not stop describing. A chronicler who rode with the army, a man named Raymond of Aguilars, later wrote that in the courtyard of the old temple, men were riding through blood that reached the knees of their horses and the reins in their hands. Another eyewitness account, known today as the Deeds of the Franks, describes the killing as so total that soldiers were wading in blood up to their ankles. A third chronicler, writing decades later from second-hand testimony, claimed the flow of blood down the streets was strong enough to carry severed hands, feet, and heads along with it. Historians today doubt the literal math behind any of these images, but they agree on what the images were meant to convey, that the killing did not stop at soldiers, and it did not stop quickly. A knight named Tancred had personally promised safety to a group of families who had barricaded themselves inside a mosque on the Temple Mount, in exchange for their surrender and whatever gold and silver they were holding. His own men broke into the building anyway and killed almost everyone inside before he could stop it, and Tancred is said to have been furious that his word had been made worthless in front of the very people he had sworn to protect. A Muslim chronicler writing roughly a century later put the death toll at 70,000 people, a number modern historians consider a wild exaggeration given that the entire city likely held no more than 20,000 to 30,000 residents at the time. Even the most conservative modern estimates still land somewhere between 3,000 and 40,000 dead in a matter of days, in a city that had just changed hands for the first time in over 450 years. The city that fell that day had changed hands many times over the centuries, passing between Roman, Persian, and various Muslim rulers long before any crusader ever set foot in the region. And for most of that history, conquest had meant new taxes and a new governor, not the wholesale slaughter of the population. What made 1099 different was the promise behind it, an army that believed killing itself had been sanctified in advance, which meant there was no theological reason left to hold anyone back once the walls came down. In the aftermath, the Crusader leaders installed one of their own commanders, Godfrey of Bouillon, as ruler of the newly captured city, and Godfrey reportedly refused the title of king outright, saying he would not wear a crown of gold in the same city where Christ had once worn a crown of thorns. He settled instead for a title that translated roughly to Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a small gesture of humility, sitting awkwardly beside the scale of what his own soldiers had just done to the city's population days earlier. The Crusader army that carried out the massacre was itself a patchwork of separate national contingents: French, German, Norman, and Italian nobles who barely trusted each other, and had spent much of the 3-year march arguing over leadership and strategy, united mainly by the shared promise waiting for them at the end of the road rather than by any real command structure. Memory of the massacre did not fade quickly on either side. Muslim chroniclers kept the story alive for generations, and historians studying Saladin's own campaign against the city nearly a century later argue that the memory of 1099 shaped how carefully he handled the surrender terms when Jerusalem finally fell back into Muslim hands, determined not to repeat the same wholesale slaughter against the city's Christian population that had defined the Crusaders' original conquest. None of the men who broke through those walls had started their journey as butchers. Most of them had left home as farmers, blacksmiths, and younger sons with no land to inherit, walking east on nothing but a promise of forgiveness. So what turns thousands of ordinary men into a mob that keeps killing long after the fighting has already been won? 3 years earlier, an even larger crowd had set out on the very same promise, with even less training and even more faith, and their story ended even faster. Number 9. The People's Crusade. Word of Pope Urban's call spread faster than any organized army could move, and a wandering preacher named Peter the Hermit turned that word into a movement of his own, months before the trained knights had even finished packing. Riding a donkey and dressed in rags, Peter preached in market squares across France and the Rhineland, claiming he carried a letter from heaven itself demanding the faithful march east immediately. Not later, not after preparation now. Tens of thousands answered him, and almost none of them were soldiers. The crowd that formed around Peter numbered somewhere close to 40,000 people by the time it crossed into the Byzantine Empire, and it included farmers, debtors, children, elderly pilgrims, and a scattering of minor knights with no real command over the rest of the column. Along the way through Germany and Hungary, hunger and impatience turned parts of the crowd violent even before they reached a single Muslim soldier, with attacks on Jewish communities in the Rhineland and looting of towns that were supposedly Christian allies along the route. By the time this ragged column reached Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I had a serious problem on his hands. A starving foreign mob camped outside his capital, months ahead of the actual Crusader army he had been expecting to arrive. Alexios did not want this crowd anywhere near his city walls, so he ferried them across the narrow strait of the Bosphorus into Anatolia and told them, through translators, to wait there for the professional soldiers still marching from Western Europe. It was, by every account, sound advice. Anatolia was Seljuk Turkish territory, contested and dangerous, and a mob armed with farm tools and a handful of swords stood no chance against trained cavalry, fighting on ground the Turks knew intimately. Byzantine officials who watched this crowd disembark reportedly struggled to describe what they were looking at. An army in name only, dragging carts of children and elderly relatives toward a war zone, as if the journey itself were the plan, and the fighting would somehow sort itself out once they arrived. Alexios had welcomed real crusader armies before, and would deal with several more in the years that followed, but nothing in Byzantine military experience had prepared his court for a movement built almost entirely on rumor and improvised faith, rather than command structure or supply lines. The actual prince's army that followed months later looked nothing like Peter's crowd. Commanders such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse each led disciplined, separately funded contingents of trained knights, marching on organized timetables with proper supply arrangements negotiated in advance with Byzantine officials. That contrast is exactly why historians treat Peter's movement as a separate, doomed prologue, rather than simply the opening chapter of the same successful campaign. They did not wait. Restless, hungry, and encouraged by a small early raid that captured a Turkish-held fortress, groups within the crowd began pushing further into Turkish territory looking for supplies and plunder of their own. On the 21st of October in 1096, the Seljuk commander Kilij Arslan I led his forces into a narrow, wooded valley near a village the chroniclers called Draken, close to the town of Sivtat, and waited for the column to walk straight into it. What followed lasted only minutes. Arrows came from the tree line before most of the crusaders even understood they were under attack, and organized fighting gave way almost instantly to slaughter and flight in every direction. Muslim chroniclers writing about the battle described the piles of Christian dead as tall enough to be mistaken for small hills scattered across the valley floor. Of the roughly 40,000 people who had followed Peter out of Europe, fewer than 3,000 are believed to have survived the ambush and the panicked retreat that followed it, many of them scrambling into an abandoned fort and holding out until Byzantine ships finally arrived to pull them to safety. Peter himself was nowhere near the valley when it happened. He had gone back to Constantinople days earlier to negotiate for more supplies, and that absence, more than any decision he ever made, is likely the only reason his name survived the campaign at all. Peter the Hermit did not disappear after Sivtat. He rejoined the main Crusader army the following year, marched with it all the way to Jerusalem, and lived to see the city fall in 1099. A survival that later chroniclers treated as proof of God's favor rather than the simple accident of timing that it actually was. The handful of survivors who limped back into Byzantine territory carried stories of the ambush that spread through Europe almost as fast as Peter's original preaching had, yet somehow did nothing to slow the flow of new volunteers heading east behind them. In the centuries since, this episode has become historical shorthand for the danger of untrained enthusiasm mistaken for military strength, referenced by later historians any time a popular movement rushes toward armed conflict, without leadership, supplies, or any realistic plan for what happens after the first arrow is fired. What exactly had those 37,000 people died for, in a valley they never should have entered, on a crusade that had not even officially begun yet? The professional army that followed months later would succeed where this one failed, take Jerusalem, and build a kingdom that lasted nearly a century, before losing almost all of it in a single afternoon on a hillside above a lake. Number 8. The Battle of Hattin. Nearly 90 years after the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, their kingdom looked stable on a map and hollow underneath it. Lords argued with each other more than they cooperated, and the man now uniting the Muslim world against them, a Kurdish general named Saladin, had spent over a decade patiently building an army and a reputation for both brilliance and mercy. In the summer of 1187, Saladin invaded the kingdom with a force of around 30,000 men, and the Crusader leadership made a decision that experienced commanders in their own army openly warned against. Rather than staying near water and forcing Saladin to come to them, the Crusader army marched across open, dry terrain toward the town of Tiberias, chasing a threat that Saladin had deliberately dangled in front of them as bait. July in that part of the world turned steel armor into something close to an oven around a man's body, and the army had almost no water discipline once it left its previous position. Saladin's forces harassed the column constantly, burning dry grass upwind to choke the Crusaders with smoke, and denying them any access to the lake they could see shimmering uselessly in the distance. Some of the same commanders in the Crusader camp had argued strongly against marching into the desert at all, warning that Saladin's plan depended entirely on cutting off water and letting the terrain do the fighting for him. But the king overruled them under pressure from more aggressive voices in his own court, a decision historians still cite as one of the single most avoidable strategic blunders of the entire crusading era. By the 4th of July, the Crusader army had collapsed onto two hills known as the Horns of Hattin, thousands of men and horses already dying of thirst before a single serious clash had even taken place. Saladin's army surrounded them and closed in, and what followed was less a battle than a methodical destruction of an army that the desert had already beaten. Survivors later described knights so weakened by thirst that they could barely lift their own swords, and horses collapsing under their riders before a single arrow had even been loosed at them. The kingdom's most sacred relic, a fragment of wood believed to be the true cross, recovered centuries earlier by the Emperor Constantine's own mother, was captured on the battlefield that day. For nearly a century, it had been carried into every major Crusader battle as a guarantee of divine protection, and its loss at Hattin was treated across Europe less like a military setback and more like proof that God himself had turned away from the entire enterprise. It was reportedly carried off to Damascus, and it has never been seen since. Saladin's reputation for mercy toward defeated enemies, earned well before this battle, is part of why his name still carries weight in both Western and Middle Eastern history today, remembered less as a purely ruthless conqueror and more as a commander who distinguished between the soldiers he fought and the civilians he ruled afterward. Saladin treated his prisoners very differently depending on who they were. King Guy of Lusignan and most of the surviving nobility were spared and treated with the courtesy expected between rulers of that era. One man was not extended that courtesy. Reynold of Chatillon, a Crusader lord who had broken a truce to attack a Muslim pilgrim caravan, was brought before Saladin personally, and Saladin executed him with his own sword on the spot, a punishment reserved for a man he considered to have broken faith rather than simply lost a war. The military backbone of the Crusader kingdom did not just lose a battle that day, it effectively ceased to exist. With almost no soldiers left to defend them, city after city surrendered to Saladin over the following weeks with barely any resistance, and by October of that same year, Jerusalem itself had surrendered as well, 88 years after the Crusaders first took it in blood. Saladin, unlike the army that had captured the city in 1099, allowed the Christian population to leave the city largely unharmed. Historians studying the collapse still find its speed remarkable. A kingdom that had taken the Crusaders roughly 4 years of sustained warfare to build in the first place, lost almost its entire territory within a matter of weeks, once the one army standing between Saladin and the coast had been removed from the board. Pope Urban III, according to later tradition, died of shock within days of hearing the news, though modern historians consider that particular story more legend than documented fact. The shock across Europe was severe enough that 3 of the continent's most powerful rulers personally took up the cross in response: the English King Richard, the French King Philip II, and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, an unprecedented gathering of royal commanders for a single campaign that history remembers simply as the Third Crusade. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe within months and triggered grief, guilt, and fury that popes would spend the next century trying to weaponize into new crusades. Some of those crusades would even carry the same holy banner towards cities that were not Muslim at all, and would never come close to reaching the Holy Land in the first place. Number 7. The sack of Constantinople. By the start of the 13th century, Constantinople had stood for roughly 900 years without ever being taken by a foreign army, protected by walls so thick and so cleverly layered that they were considered one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient and medieval world combined. The city held wealth, relics, and libraries that dwarfed anything in Western Europe at the time, and it was, at least on paper, a Christian ally that crusaders were supposed to be defending, not attacking. Visiting crusaders from earlier campaigns had already written home describing Constantinople's markets and churches with something close to disbelief, a city larger and richer than anything most of them had ever seen in their own homelands. The Fourth Crusade never even reached the Holy Land. Crushing debts owed to Venetian shipbuilders, combined with the scheming of a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos who wanted his father restored to the throne, redirected the entire army toward Constantinople instead, with promises of gold, soldiers, and support for the coming war against Islam once the political situation there was fixed. The promised money never fully materialized. Tensions boiled over between the crusaders camped outside the walls and the population inside them, and what began as a political intervention slowly turned into a full siege of a Christian capital by a Christian army. On the 12th of April in 1204, Crusader forces finally breached the legendary walls, something no army, Christian or otherwise, had managed to do in 9 centuries. What followed was 3 days that historians still struggle to fully describe. Soldiers looted churches across the city, stripped the Hagia Sophia of its treasures, and melted down priceless bronze statues simply for their value as coin. Libraries containing manuscripts that were the last surviving copies of ancient Greek and Roman texts were burned, scattered, or simply lost, an act of cultural destruction whose true scale historians are still trying to calculate today. Venetian soldiers, more interested in portable wealth than in gold alone, stripped entire monuments from public squares and shipped them home. A set of 4 bronze horses that had stood in the city's chariot racing stadium for the better part of 1,000 years was taken down, crated, and hauled back to Venice, where they were mounted above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica, a visible trophy of the sack that tourists still photograph today, without always knowing where it actually came from. Venice itself came out of the disaster enormously enriched, claiming a large share of Byzantine trading posts and island territory across the eastern Mediterranean. And the sack marks the point where the Italian maritime republics finally overtook Constantinople as the dominant trading power in the region, a shift in economic gravity that outlasted the Crusader states that triggered it by centuries. Byzantine loyalists did not simply vanish either. Refugee nobles fled to the city of Nicaea and set up a government in exile that continued to call itself the legitimate empire for the next several decades, one of several rival successor states competing for the same throne, until Constantinople was finally retaken from the Crusader occupiers in 1261. The British historian Stephen Runciman, writing in the 1950s, called it one of the greatest crimes ever committed against human civilization, arguing that no single event did more damage to the connection between Western and Eastern Christianity, and by extension between Europe and the classical world it claimed to be protecting. Pope Innocent III, the same man who had called for this crusade in the first place, was reportedly horrified when he learned what had happened, and condemned the sack of a Christian city by soldiers wearing the cross almost as forcefully as he had once condemned the enemies of that cross. Byzantine forces eventually recaptured their own capital in 1261, nearly 60 years later, but the empire that returned was a shell of what had existed before the sack, its treasury emptied, its territory fractured among rival claimants, and its population scattered across the region. Weakened beyond any real recovery, the restored empire limped along for roughly 2 more centuries before finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, a collapse that many historians trace directly back to the wound this crusade inflicted on it. The Crusaders installed a Latin emperor of their own choosing on the Byzantine throne and carved up the empire's territory among themselves, an arrangement that lasted decades, but never gained the loyalty of a Greek-speaking population that now viewed the West with a suspicion it would never fully lose. Some modern historians argue that the fracture opened by this single crusade did more long-term damage to relations between Eastern and Western Christianity than centuries of earlier theological disagreement ever managed on its own. If a crusade against a fellow Christian empire could be justified with the right combination of debt and ambition, it is worth asking what happened when that same justification turned inward, against Christians who were not just politically inconvenient, but accused of believing the wrong things about God entirely. Number 6. The Massacre at Beziers. In the south of France, a religious movement known as Catharism had spread through towns and countryside for generations, teaching a version of Christianity that the Catholic Church considered dangerous heresy, one that rejected much of the Church's authority and wealth outright, along with core teachings about the material world itself. Rather than sending missionaries to argue theology, Pope Innocent III eventually did something no pope had done before against fellow Europeans. He called an actual crusade, complete with the same promised forgiveness of sins offered to men who had once marched to Jerusalem, against Christians living inside Christian Europe itself. For decades before the crusade, local nobles in the region had tolerated or quietly protected Cathar communities, some out of genuine sympathy, others simply because taxing and governing a religiously mixed population was easier than persecuting a large share of it. That toleration is precisely what made the region a target, a wealthy corner of France where the Church's authority had visibly weakened, and where a crusade promised land and titles to any northern lord willing to bring an army south. A minor northern French noble named Simon de Montfort emerged from the ranks of the crusading army within its first year, and was quickly granted command over the campaign, along with the lands and titles seized from local lords accused of harboring heretics. He would go on to lead the war for nearly a decade, building a reputation for ruthless efficiency, before dying in 1218 at the siege of Toulouse, struck by a stone hurled from a catapult, reportedly operated by the women of the besieged city itself. As with the massacre at Jerusalem a century earlier, modern historians treat the round number of 20,000 dead at Beziers as a contemporary estimate rather than a precise census, though even the most conservative modern readings still describe a death toll in the thousands, inflicted on a single town in the space of a single day. The first major target was the town of Beziers, home to a mixed population of Cathars and Catholics living side by side, often within the very same families. On the 21st of July in 1209, the crusading army's papal legate, an abbot named Arnaud Amalric, sent a demand into the town, hand over roughly 222 named heretics, or face the consequences of refusal. The town refused, whether out of loyalty, defiance, or simple inability to sort neighbor from neighbor by belief alone. Beziers had no walls strong enough, and no garrison large enough to hold off a crusading army of thousands for long, and its leaders may genuinely have believed refusal was the safer option compared to handing over 222 of their own neighbors to almost certain execution. What happened next was not a negotiated siege. The town was stormed, set on fire, and its population slaughtered, an estimated 20,000 people killed with no serious attempt made to separate the accused heretics from ordinary Catholics who happened to live in the same streets. According to a chronicle written decades after the event, when a soldier reportedly asked how they were supposed to tell a heretic from a faithful Catholic in the chaos, Arnaud Amalric is said to have answered simply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The historian Joseph Strayer, examining the sources centuries later, doubted that Amalric ever spoke those exact words, noting the account only appears in a later chronicle rather than a contemporary one. But Strayer and most historians since him agree on something more disturbing than the authenticity of a quote, whether or not those specific words were ever spoken aloud. They accurately describe exactly what happened on the ground that day, a massacre that made no distinction at all between the guilty and the innocent. Beziers was not an isolated atrocity, but the opening act of a campaign that would grind on for 2 decades across southern France, eventually crushing Catharism as an organized movement and reshaping the political map of the region under the direct control of the French crown. Later sieges in the same campaign, at towns like Carcassonne and Lavaur, followed a similar pattern of mass executions and forced conversions, and the machinery built to hunt down the last Cathar holdouts eventually evolved into the medieval Inquisition itself, an institution that would outlive the crusade that inspired it by centuries. It also left behind something harder to measure than territory, a template proving that the machinery of holy war, indulgences, forgiveness of sins, promised land and plunder, could be pointed at fellow Christians just as effectively as it had once been pointed toward Jerusalem. If grown men with armies could be convinced that burning their own neighbors was holy work, it is worth asking what happened when that same religious fever reached people with no armies at all, no weapons, and in one infamous case, not even enough years behind them to understand what they were marching toward in the first place. Number 5. The Children's Crusade. In the summer of 1212, 2 separate and largely unconnected religious movements broke out within months of each other, one led by a boy preacher named Nicholas in the Rhineland region of Germany, the other by a shepherd boy named Stephen in northern France. Both claimed visions instructing them to march to the Holy Land, and both insisted that where armored knights had failed for over a century, the pure faith of the poor and the innocent would succeed where swords could not. News of the 2 movements reached each other within weeks, and rather than treating one as a copy of the other, chroniclers of the time seem to view the near-simultaneous appearance of both as further proof that something larger than either boy preacher was genuinely stirring across the continent. The Latin word used in the chronicles to describe these participants, puri, is usually translated simply as children, and that translation is largely responsible for the legend that has survived for 800 years. Historians studying the original sources point out that puri was also medieval shorthand for the poor and the powerless more broadly, meaning the movements were likely made up mostly of landless peasants, servants, and adolescents rather than literal small children, though younger participants certainly existed among their ranks. That distinction matters for how the tragedy is understood today. A mass movement of desperate poor people failed by every authority around them reads very differently than a literal army of small children marching alone, even though both versions end in roughly the same body count. Unlike every other crusade on this list, this one was never authorized by the Pope or by any king. It was a grassroots movement that horrified the church authorities who heard about it, precisely because it had no organization, no supplies, and no realistic plan beyond faith itself. Local clergy along the route tried repeatedly to talk participants into turning back, warning them plainly that children and paupers with no weapons and no money could not simply walk to the Mediterranean and expect the sea to part or a fleet to appear waiting for them. Nicholas's group in Germany attempted to cross the Alps toward Mediterranean ports, and historians estimate that roughly 2 out of every 3 participants died from exhaustion, exposure, and starvation before they ever reached Italian soil at all. Of the thousands who did survive the journey and reach port cities like Marseille and Genoa, not a single documented group of these crusaders ever set foot in the Holy Land. There is no serious historical evidence that they were sold into slavery by treacherous merchants, a version of the ending popularized centuries later that turned a tragedy of exhaustion and mismanagement into a more dramatic tale of betrayal. The most likely reality is quieter and just as bleak. Most of these young and poor travelers simply gave up, turned back, or died along roads that offered them nothing but the promise they had followed out of home in the first place. The slavery ending first appears in chronicles written decades after the events it describes, long after any living witness could confirm or deny it, and modern historians treat it the way they treat most colorful medieval additions layered onto an already grim story, a moral lesson dressed up as history, meant to warn future generations against the exact kind of unauthorized religious fervor that had produced this movement in the first place. Later medieval writers used the episode as a cautionary tale about misplaced innocence and unchecked crowd enthusiasm, a theme that echoed through European folklore for centuries afterward in stories about entire communities of young people lured away and never seen again. Tales that borrowed the emotional shape of this real disaster, while discarding almost everything true about how it actually happened. This was not the last time an unauthorized popular movement tried to march east under a religious banner either. Decades later, a wave of shepherds in northern France rallied behind a mysterious preacher, claiming a vision from the Virgin Mary, only for that movement to collapse into rioting against the very churches and clergy it claimed to be marching to defend. Why does the invented ending, children sold in chains on a slave ship, feel more memorable today than the true one? Thousands of exhausted teenagers and paupers quietly dying of hunger in mountain passes because no king or pope bothered to organize or stop them. Perhaps because betrayal makes for a story with a villain, while starvation through simple neglect implicates almost everyone who could have intervened and chose not to. Not every crusade on this list ended in tragedy without a fight. Some of the most brutal chapters of this era came from crusaders who won their battles decisively and simply chose to keep killing long after the victory itself was already secured. Number 4. The Lionheart's Massacre. After Jerusalem fell to Saladin, kings across Europe finally answered the call personally, instead of sending armies under lesser commanders. Richard I of England, a battle-hardened veteran already nicknamed the Lionheart, arrived in the Holy Land determined to reverse Saladin's victories, and the two men would spend the next several years locked in one of the most famous rivalries of the entire medieval period. The campaign opened with a grinding 2-year siege of the port city of Acre, a fight so long and so miserable that disease killed more men on both sides than combat did, including at one point an English king and a French king, both falling seriously ill in the very same camp. Chroniclers describe entire sections of both camps bedridden at once, a plague moving through tents faster than either side's engineers could move siege towers into position, turning what should have been a straightforward coastal siege into a slow, grinding war of attrition against illness, as much as against the city's defenders. The city finally surrendered on the 12th of July in 1191, and its garrison of roughly 3,000 men, along with their families, became prisoners of war whose fate depended entirely on a ransom payment Saladin had agreed to provide. Saladin missed the agreed deadline for the first installment of that ransom, whether through genuine difficulty gathering the sum or as a deliberate delaying tactic. Historians still debate. Richard's response was immediate and brutal. In August of that year, on a hill near Acre called Hattin, in full view of Saladin's own army camped nearby, Richard ordered the execution of nearly 2,700 prisoners, along with a number of women and children among the captives. It remains one of the largest deliberate mass executions of the entire crusading era, carried out by a king remembered in later legend chiefly for his chivalry. Word of the executions at Hattin spread quickly through both armies, and some chroniclers on the Muslim side describe it as hardening Saladin's own resolve never to offer Richard easy terms again, a grievance that lingered over every negotiation session for the rest of the campaign. Weeks later, at the Battle of Arsuf on the 7th of September, Richard demonstrated the military skill that built his legend in the first place, holding his marching column together under relentless harassment from Saladin's cavalry, and then unleashing a disciplined countercharge that routed the Muslim army, inflicting losses estimated above 7,000 men against roughly 700 Crusader casualties, one of the most lopsided tactical victories of the entire century. That single battle is still studied today as a textbook example of disciplined infantry formations, absorbing repeated cavalry harassment without breaking rank, a level of battlefield control that few commanders of the period ever managed to replicate. Despite years of warfare between them, Richard and Saladin never once met face to face, conducting all diplomacy through envoys and Saladin's own brother, and the two men reportedly exchanged gifts as a show of mutual respect, including fruit and snow sent to help Richard recover from a bout of fever during a lull in the fighting. At one point, Richard even proposed a marriage alliance between his own sister and Saladin's brother, with a plan for the couple to jointly rule Jerusalem and share access to the city between both faiths, a genuinely creative solution that ultimately collapsed under objections from advisors on both sides who considered it unworkable. The war eventually ended not with the fall of Jerusalem, but with a negotiated truce. Jerusalem stayed under Muslim control, while Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage to visit the city whenever they wished. Richard's own journey home turned into its own smaller humiliation. Shipwrecked and forced to travel overland through hostile territory in disguise, he was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, a nobleman he had personally insulted during the siege of Acre, and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who held the celebrated Lionheart for ransom in a German castle for well over a year before England finally paid the enormous sum required to free its own king. The truce Richard negotiated held only as long as he was alive to enforce it, and Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands for another generation after his death, until a very different kind of crusader, one this list has not reached yet, managed to get the city back without a single battle at all. How does history remember a king who ordered the mass execution of prisoners on a hilltop as one of its great chivalrous heroes? Perhaps because legend prefers a rivalry of mutual respect and traded gifts to the far uglier truth of what happened at Hattin. Richard was hardly the last Crusader king whose personal faith and public brutality sat side by side. Decades later, a French king even more famous for his piety would learn that devotion alone could not save an army from total collapse. Number 3. The King in Chains. Louis IX of France was, by nearly every account from his own era, one of the most genuinely devout rulers in medieval Europe, a king who fasted, prayed for hours daily, wore simple clothing despite his enormous wealth, and would later be formally recognized by the Church as a saint, one of the very few medieval monarchs ever granted that honor. In 1248, he personally led a massive crusade against Egypt, believing that conquering the heart of Muslim power in the region would finally secure Jerusalem for good. Louis had spent years and a fortune preparing for this campaign, building an entire new port at Aigues Mortes on the French coast, specifically to launch the invasion fleet, and assembling one of the largest and best-funded crusading armies of the entire era. All of that preparation still could not overcome an enemy that understood the terrain and the Nile's flood cycles far better than any invading force ever could, and the same river that Louis's engineers had counted on for supply barges turned against them within weeks, flooding at exactly the wrong moment and cutting off the roads his own army needed to retreat along. The campaign advanced deep into Egyptian territory before it collapsed entirely. Louis's forces were lured toward the city of Massacre, overextended their supply lines, and were gradually surrounded by Egyptian forces who cut off any route of retreat or resupply. By early February of 1250, disease and starvation were doing as much damage to the Crusader army as enemy soldiers were, and on the 6th of April, Louis surrendered to his captors. The King of France, the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, was led away in chains, a detail chroniclers on both sides recorded with something close to disbelief. Back in Paris, his mother Blanche of Castile had already been running the kingdom as regent during his absence, and she now faced the added task of raising an enormous ransom while keeping the throne stable in the face of a captured king and a shattered army abroad. When negotiations for his release began, Louis made an unusual demand that surprised his captors, insisting the ransom cover the freedom of every captured Christian soldier, not merely himself and his nobles, a condition most defeated commanders of that era simply never bothered to include. The final price for his freedom combined a personal ransom, a payment of 400,000 livres tournois for his surviving army, and the surrender of the city of Damietta back to Egyptian control. Historians estimate that 400,000 livres came to well over a year's ordinary income for the crown of France, an almost unthinkable sum raised and delivered specifically to buy back an army that had already lost the campaign outright. Collecting that sum required emergency taxation across the kingdom on a scale rarely seen outside of open warfare on French soil itself, a burden ordinary subjects of the crown felt for years afterward in the form of higher levies and stripped royal treasuries. Beyond the financial toll, the defeat strengthened the very military faction in Egypt that would soon replace the old ruling dynasty entirely. The Mamluk soldier class, whose officers had distinguished themselves fighting Louis's army and who would go on, within a generation, to lead the campaigns that eventually destroyed what remained of the Crusader states along the coast for good. Freed on the 6th of May in 1250, Louis did not sail home in humiliation. He stayed in the Holy Land for 4 more years at his own expense, funding fortifications and diplomacy in cities still held by Christian forces, before finally returning to France to a population that, remarkably, still viewed him as a model of Christian kingship rather than a failed commander. Piety outlasted the defeat itself. 2 decades later, Louis launched yet another crusade, this time against Tunis, and died there of disease in 1270, still convinced his cause was righteous, even after his first crusade had ended in chains. Louis marched into Egypt convinced that faith and righteousness would carry an army where strategy alone could not, and it nearly destroyed him. One Crusader king took the opposite approach entirely, arriving in the Holy Land already condemned by his own church, and negotiating a peace that no army of the entire era had managed to win by force. Number 2. The Bloodless Crusade. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most unusual rulers of the medieval period, set out on his crusade already excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX, punished for delaying a previous departure due to illness, an excommunication the Pope refused to lift even after Frederick actually set sail for the Holy Land. He arrived in the Holy Land technically forbidden from receiving the sacraments of his own church, a status that followed him through the entire campaign. Contemporaries nicknamed Frederick Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, for his fluency in multiple languages, his fascination with science and philosophy, and his genuine respect for Islamic scholarship, a combination that made him deeply strange to many of his fellow crusaders. His own court back in Sicily was famously multicultural, staffed with Muslim scholars, astronomers, and physicians at a time when most European courts treated such figures with suspicion at best. And Frederick brought that same comfort with cultural difference directly into a negotiation his own church expected to end in bloodshed. The military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, wary of associating too closely with an excommunicated commander, kept a careful physical distance from him throughout the campaign, refusing to march directly alongside his forces. Rather than preparing for battle, Frederick opened direct negotiations with the Egyptian Sultan, Al-Kamil, speaking with him in Arabic and engaging in what chroniclers describe as genuine intellectual exchange between the two men, discussions that reportedly touched on philosophy and religion as much as they touched on politics. Both rulers, for their own separate political reasons, had strong incentive to avoid a costly war, and that shared incentive produced something no crusader army had achieved through force in over a century of trying. Historians still debate the episode as a kind of natural experiment buried inside a violent era, clear proof that direct negotiation between rulers who respected each other could accomplish in a matter of weeks what generations of holy war, indulgences, and mass mobilization had repeatedly failed to secure through combat alone. In February of 1229, the two men signed a treaty. Jerusalem would be returned to Christian control, but the Temple Mount, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, would remain under Muslim religious authority, and the Muslim residents of Jerusalem would keep their homes and a degree of self-governance within the city. It was a compromise almost nobody on either side fully trusted, but it held for the length of the truce agreed alongside it. Roughly a decade, longer than most military conquests of the era managed to hold their own gains, without renewed fighting breaking out. On the 17th of March in 1229, Frederick walked into Jerusalem and accepted the city's surrender without a single battle having been fought for it, the only crusader in the entire era to take the city through negotiation rather than force. There was no religious ceremony welcoming him. No patriarch of Jerusalem would crown an excommunicated emperor, so Frederick reportedly took a crown from the altar himself and placed it on his own head, in front of an audience of his own soldiers, rather than any church official willing to bless the moment. Back in Europe, the reaction from church officials was closer to outrage than celebration, and the Pope's own forces used Frederick's absence to invade his territories in Italy, a betrayal Frederick had to rush home and deal with almost as soon as his diplomatic triumph was secured. Within roughly 15 years, Jerusalem was lost to Christian control once again, this time for good. Frederick's conflict with the papacy never fully healed after his return. He was excommunicated a second time later in his reign during unrelated political disputes with the Pope, and some of his fiercest clerical critics went so far as to brand him the Antichrist in circulating pamphlets, an extraordinary label for a man whose single military campaign had actually returned Jerusalem to Christian hands without spilling any blood at all. The one crusader who achieved the goal every previous army had died trying to reach did it without swinging a sword, and the church that had excommunicated him never fully forgave him for succeeding on his own terms. It leaves an uncomfortable question hanging over the entire era. What if the quiet diplomacy that worked in 1229 had been tried first, before any of the massacres that came before it? That question would not matter for long. Within 2 generations, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land would be gone entirely, ending not with a treaty, but with the final siege of its very last major stronghold. Number 1. The fall of Acre. By the final decade of the 13th century, the once sprawling Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast had shrunk to a handful of cities, and the largest and wealthiest of what remained was the port of Acre, a fortified trading hub that had survived roughly a century as the effective capital of what was left of the Crusader kingdom. The immediate spark for the final siege was almost absurdly small compared to the scale of what followed. A dispute in Acre's marketplace in which Crusader soldiers attacked Muslim merchants, and the city's authorities refused to hand over those responsible when demanded. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, used the incident to launch a massive invasion, bringing a force estimated around 45,000 men against a defending garrison of roughly 15,000 knights, mercenaries, and townspeople, a numerical advantage of nearly 3-1. The Mamluk army arrived with one of the largest siege trains ever assembled in the region, close to 100 catapults and siege engines, several of them massive enough to have their own individual names, including one called Al-Mansura, meaning the victorious, and another called Al-Gadba, meaning the furious. For 6 weeks beginning on the 6th of April in 1291, these machines battered the city's double walls day and night, while the defenders mounted increasingly desperate sorties that bought time, but never came close to breaking the siege itself. As the outer wall crumbled under the bombardment, ships began quietly loading civilians and valuables for evacuation to Cyprus, even as the garrison kept fighting, a grim acknowledgement from the city's own leadership that the outcome was no longer in doubt, and the only real question left was how many people could be gotten out before the end arrived. On the 18th of May, the walls finally gave way. Mamluk forces poured into the breach to the sound of war drums mounted on hundreds of camels, a deliberate tactic meant to terrify the defenders and drown out any attempt at organized resistance. What followed inside the city was chaotic, brutal, and largely unrecorded in detail, though every surviving account agrees the killing was extensive, and the panic among civilians trying to reach the harbor was total and immediate. Accounts from survivors describe William falling in front of his own men rather than retreating to safety, a detail that later chroniclers held up as proof that even at the very end of the crusading era, some of its commanders still fought exactly the way the old legends had always claimed they would. William of Beaujeu, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, died defending the walls during the final assault, struck down leading one of the last organized counterattacks the city could still manage. His death effectively removed the last coordinated military leadership left in Acre, and organized defense collapsed within hours of it happening. The Templar order he led would survive Acre's fall by only about 2 more decades before being suppressed entirely across Europe, its remaining leadership arrested, and its vast landholdings seized. A slower but equally final ending for the military order that had spent nearly 2 centuries defending Crusader territory in the Holy Land. The Kingdom of Jerusalem survived the fall of Acre only in name, a title held afterward by rulers based on the island of Cyprus, who never again controlled a meaningful foothold on the mainland, and every later attempt to reclaim the coast failed outright. Acre's fall closed nearly 200 years of Crusader presence in the Holy Land, a presence that had opened in 1099 with knights wading through blood inside Jerusalem's walls, and ended in 1291 with a different city's walls finally giving way for the last time. News of Acre's fall reached Europe within weeks, and was met with widespread mourning and formal calls from several popes over the following decades for yet another crusade to reclaim the coast. None of those calls ever produced an army anywhere close to the scale of the ones that had marched 2 centuries earlier, and the crusading movement toward the Holy Land, after 200 years of shifting fortune, simply faded into occasional rhetoric rather than actual campaigns. Trading contacts between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean continued regardless of who held which fortress, a reminder that commerce had quietly outlasted the religious wars meant to control it. 10 crusades, and almost none of them ended the way the men who started them expected. Jerusalem was taken in blood and lost in a single afternoon of thirst. A crowd of the faithful marched east with no weapons and found an ambush waiting instead of glory. A Christian capital was sacked by a Christian army chasing debt instead of Islam. Neighbors were burned alongside heretics because sorting the guilty from the innocent took more effort than killing everyone at once. Children, or the closest thing history had to them, walked into mountains that swallowed most of them whole. A king remembered for chivalry ordered thousands executed on a hillside. Another king remembered for sainthood was marched away from his own defeat in chains. And the one man who took Jerusalem without spilling a drop of blood did it as an outcast condemned by his own church. Taken, sacked, burned, betrayed, ransomed. Won quietly by an excommunicated emperor. And finally, lost for good, behind drums mounted on camels, and walls that had held for 2 centuries and then simply didn't. 10 separate wars, spread across nearly 2 centuries, and almost every single one of them reveals the same uncomfortable pattern once you look past the banners. Ordinary people paying in blood for decisions made far above their heads, by men who mostly survived to write their own version of events afterward. If you had to defend one of these 10 crusades as the true turning point of the entire medieval world, which one would you pick? And which one do you think history has gotten the most wrong? Say it in the comments, and if this kind of history keeps your attention past the 10-minute mark, subscribing means you will not miss what comes next, because the medieval world left behind plenty more wars fought in the name of something holy.